Hello and welcome back to On Landscape with Joe Cornish. We are continuing our conversation about your adventures at the start of 2019, and we've moved on from Cornwall to the Lake District, where I believe you were on a workshop with David Ward, having returned from Africa.
Yes, absolutely. However, yes. Just to throw a spanner in the works, we're here. This particular picture is in fact Newton Wood, so it's walking distance from home.
Okay.
So before I went to the lakes, we had a misty day, and I went up with my dog and camera, and no tripod. And
no tripod?
At least I don't think so. Actually, I'm lying. 0.8 seconds.
I would be very impressed.
Yeah, no, I did take a tripod. Sorry, I did that. Mark Littlejohn, who's been having a contaminating effect on me. So, anyway.
Yes.
Yeah, and we're in Lightroom here, Tim. So this is a difference that is fun for me. I still do use Lightroom some of the time, but have a bit of a natural preference for Capture One.
Now, what we should say here is you've actually processed these photographs we're going to look at in Capture One, but as you say, these are all unprocessed. So we're going to do a little bit of quick processing in Lightroom, but when we look at the final picture, we'll go to the Capture One to look at.
See if I got anyone near it.
Yeah,
yeah, that's right.
Understanding that when you reprocess a picture, you never get anything that looks exactly the same as when you did it before.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, so Newton Wood, what have we done with this, or what would you do with this?
What would I do? Well, I suppose the first argument is, I mean, I think I was pretty certain I was going to do it as a monochrome, black and white image, and part of me thinks, well, as a colour photographer, shouldn't I always be trying to make colour images? I'm going to just whack the saturation up and just see if there's any argument for a colour version of it by cooling it down, because it's much too
using that to try and create a balance of colour.
Yeah, so that exactly. So the blue, the warm cool mix blend, does that look natural? And clearly the magenta green mix. So it's worth saying that when you get ridiculous looking figures like plus 49 in a tint slider, that is at least in part down to the fact that all the light is filtering through early summer green.
A heavy green tint.
And so there's a green filter on the image already. Now, I'm not saying that does look a little bit magenta, but I'll bet that if we were to come back to, let's say, plus 34, it's already looking green, which I think is okay.
Yeah.
However, having said all of that, I probably still favour black and white. I saw, to my mind, this was one of those where the forms and the textures and the light are actually really are enhanced by being seen without colour. It's a way for me of slightly simplifying, but it's also photographic roots for me, because I did a huge amount of black and white photography as a youngster, and indeed in my early professional career I was still asked to do a lot of black and white work, and I still love it. I love looking at black and white photography.
And it's beautiful in conditions like this, where you're getting a sense of mist aerial perspective or a mist perspective.
Exactly, because some of the clues of depth that are lost in when you lose the colour are still more than compensated for by the aerial perspective. So that's always quite a strong argument actually about colour versus black and white. And colour photographers can rightly claim that there's a great deal more inherent depth in a colour photograph because of the extra, the colour information does give you that depth. And I'm not trying to pick a fight with black and white photographers here, by the way. I just think that's a fact. And black and white photographers are brilliant at what they do because they find ways of overcoming the apparent absence of colour. So if we're looking at black and white, should we immediately go to the black and white module?
Yes.
In Capture One. I beg your pardon, in Lightroom even. And see, we've got this nice black and white mix. Everything's zeroed at the moment. I think we're pretty confident that it's going to be about green first and foremost, so we can move the green. So
now here's a quick question for you. I presume that this tonal variation works after you've done the colour temperature and tint adjustments, otherwise everything would be green. You wouldn't get no variation on the other channels.
Well, it's very interesting you should say that, because that when you change the white balance, you also change the black and white mix response.
Yes, yeah, so it does make a difference.
It does make a difference, and it's well worth remembering that. I'm not saying that that anything I did in that color adjustment was orientated towards this this understanding though. So if for a particular reason you needed to separate colors out in that way, in a more let's say a more polychromatic environment,
yes,
then it's well worth looking at that balance to enhance what you then did in a black and white mix.
Try and get as many separated colours as possible in your colour
Absolutely,
mixture,
because then you've got more control. Whereas I would say here, this is a very monochromatic scene.
Yes.
So the differences that could be made are not quite irrelevant, but they're not so significant. So I think yellow and green are going to be the ones, aren't they? And we can see that yellow's not doing that much actually.
No.
So it is mainly green, and I'm sort of moving towards light because that's where I was with the emotional kind of side of it, and I'll talk about that in a minute. If you go that way, well, yes, you create a very congested and quite moody look. It sort of slightly reminds me of Sally Mann's photographs from the American South. That sort of dark, rich sort of tones. Whereas if you go in the other direction, what happens is that the trees become separated out from the background.
Yeah, so it's not infrared look, but it's got that sense of an IR.
It's
look.
moving in that direction. I'll absolutely grant you. I'm not aiming to blow it out.
And I think it may be when you go the other direction. It's the Sally Mann look is the monocolour response of her wet plate work.
Could be.
Where greens don't react.
It could be. That's actually pretty interesting, isn't it? You go,
because it does look like that, which reminds me of it. It's quite nice.
Yeah.
But yes, go on.
So I mean, I'm not sure if I'd go quite as far as that, but that would be my direction of travel, if only because what I particularly, I mean, you could argue the toss about what the evocation might be in either of those approaches, but for me, that my initial thinking is around the trees, how to make them the kind of graphic foundation or structure of the composition, because I love the trees, particularly love the trees on the right. Now you might say, well, I love the trees on the right so much, how come I photographed the trees on the left at all? And the reason is that I actually did try to, and then just came to the conclusion that this is such a satisfactory balanced window.
Talked about Lorraine earlier on. It's that sense of closure in the framing,
absolutely. Okay, anyway, let's leave it where it is for now. I just want to point out a couple of things. Composition, we've talked about composition many times, and one of my kind of personal pursuits in composition is to look for resolution in detail, and especially when it comes to woodland, I get a kind of perverse joy and pleasure from this sort of thing.
Okay, yes.
That's a 4:1, by the way, I beg your pardon. Let's just go to 1:1.
Yeah, it's nice, isn't it? Yes.
So,
overlapping waves.
Including this, that little bit of, just that bit of, tiny bit of air, like 2 pixels wide, of separating those elements. So, believe it or not, I actually used that as the positioning control for where I put the camera.
Okay, yeah.
So if you think, once I'd established I wanted to create this cross pattern and preserve that little bit of negative space around it, that then forced me to adopt a particular position, since, and everything else then was subordinated to that. If we look over here, you can see there's a couple of slightly awkward juxtapositions, but on the whole, these branches separate out quite nicely as well.
Can you hold on a second?
Yeah, having lots of pesky cats around is trying to. So while in Tim's absence, while he dispatches the cats to the main part of the house,
if you heard sniffing noises, that's the cat trying to eat the microphone.
Yeah, exactly. We have a composition that's kind of dictated to, and that's not to say that I would not, if I realised I couldn't make the picture work, but it worked in other ways, I wouldn't change. I absolutely would do. But as it happens, I felt that using that kind of what my old friend Nick Mears used to call a tweaky thing, compositionally, it helped me to decide where I wanted to place the camera.
Yeah.
And then I have a couple of other compositions I shot at the same time. They're a bit wider, but actually in the end, this one distills the kind of essence of the forms really nicely. I love these trees, and they're not particularly old, as you can see. The Newton wood is, well, I don't know the deep history of it, but a lot of it was industrialised.
Is it rocky ground, is it?
It's rough ground, it's not rocky ground.
Okay.
Some of it has been dug about by mining in the late 19th century. And I'm fairly sure that most of it was abandoned to nature or left, and it might have had a little bit of regrowth, but most of it is regenerated naturally since around the turn of the 20th century, so in about 1900. So you're looking at trees that are in the region of 80 to 100, 120 years old. And they've not been planted for harvesting. And they have that wonderful, well, they're oaks for a start. There's a mixture of elsewhere in the wood of sycamore as well, and holly and ash and so on, but this is a particularly oak-rich part of the wood, and oaks have so much character.
Yeah, the contorted branches,
yeah.
the way they seemingly reach around for things.
And it's a really kind of busy conversation between them all. So I just feel that it does, it's one of those pictures where you can see, yes, the trees have a relationship, they have a dependence on each other, and they have many human elements to them as well. Okay, shall we
move on?
Move on.
I'm moving on to the Lake District now.
Yes. So we were based in the southwest, and all our activity really was in the southwest and the far west. So this is in the Esk Valley, and it is, I believe, the River Esk. As you can see, fantastic rock formations that are exposed here.
Granite, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Beautifully smoothed, and its native colour is red, but the greens are very evident everywhere, and that's both a combination of river weed here and reflected summer greens from surrounding woodland.
So what time of year was this? March, April?
No, it's summer. It's very recent. Yeah, it's only, so we're right at the beginning of, well, actually mid-June. Mid-June, yeah.
So
full on green, and it's quite challenging to know. Is one we should embrace our greens, should we not? I suppose it's always long been a problem for me. I've found greens a very difficult colour, but there's no denying that the green is there. So this is the unedited raw file, and so I think I would.
And you would usually work with auto white balance, would you, on your camera? Is this an IQ or a Sony?
This is Sony.
Yeah.
And it looks like it's a kind of random yes. So when you look at the white balance, it's quite a good clue, isn't it? Usually, if you can tell it's an auto white by it having a no particular temperature and tint combination. And Sony, I think the A7R2 does a remarkably good job most of the time, but you're still obviously depending on it's then being translated by Adobe.
Yeah.
So that's another sort of different interpretation of the colour, and no doubt it looks different if you loaded it in Capture One. So you take it as you find it. I think it might be worth just mentioning that if we look here, this is a new feature in Capture One. In Lightroom rather. This kind of profile feature, and it now appears. I think you still have calibration at the bottom, but they've changed it so that it's got version 5. But previously, you used to get drop downs here with various different profiles.
Yeah, and they're all built into that colour now.
And here we have a landscape portrait kind of standard type mode. I mean, the only thing I I might do is go to standard, perhaps to get a flatter response.
It's a subtle difference, isn't it?
Yeah. Adobe Color is giving quite a rich response, but I'd rather personally build it up from below as a general rule. I think that it's worth perhaps saying at this stage with this one that I see, what was I thinking about? What was I seeing from my perch in the middle of the river? More the sort of, it's an abstraction in a way, but the animus of the rocks, that these rocks kind of facing each other off like ancient animals in the river. Maybe that's a bit fanciful, but I don't really think it, well, I don't know, maybe it does work in black and white. My inclination was to try to bring it together in colour.
I think there's such a characteristic contrast between the rock and the green that the colour works quite nicely.
Yeah, and maybe that's a way that we would look to separate the colours. So if we were to do that, I usually do this sort of what David calls a soak test or saturation up, and then have a little play with the blue and yellow sliding. You can see blue, yellow, so blue, yellow. And somewhere in there is a balance of casts, and that's the way to think about it. Because you're going to see both a cast of blue. You need to see that probably in the highlights, but also there's still going to be some yellow values, particularly in the greens of the river. And not that far from where we started. The same applies with tint, with slightly more radical green, magenta. But you can see how the magenta allows you to power up the magenta a little bit. It does bring the rock up, and it keeps the greens under control. However, if, as we've seen previously, if you
slight increase works there, doesn't it? Not much at all.
So probably I think around about 20. The greens are still quite alive. And I will often find I'm going to go back to the white balance to tune them a little bit further later. By then, it's very much about mood and emotion. My initial white balance is really balanced.
Yes.
Simple as that.
Get a good starting point to work with on for everything else.
And the great thing is it does separate out the colours. So I just zeroed the saturation slider, and for the next few seconds you're thinking, wow, it's flat.
All the colour's gone. And then your eye adapts again.
And it does. And at the same time, I don't know if you find this, but in Lightroom I often find that with landscape subjects, a default of around 20 will often give quite natural looking saturation. And maybe that's because it's on a laptop. Maybe if it was on a main monitor, it wouldn't be so much.
It could be. Many of these software programs are tuned to human skin. So possibly that's just the way it's been programmed. So zero saturation works for a natural skin colour.
Right.
Possibly.
I don't know about you, but I find that laptops and RGB, full RGB monitors vary quite a lot. Even when you look at the same picture, and even when in theory it's in the same colour space.
I do scanning work, and I have the ISO monitor, and I won't say often, but when I first started using the ISO, I would ask. A few clients would come back asking me to add a little bit more punch to the scans.
Yeah, I can understand that.
The ones that don't know how to use Photoshop.
So now that we've got used to the colour again, maybe a time to start targeting the colours a little bit more. I think these highlights, by the way, I used a polarizer for this, believe it or not. So looking right into the sort of reflected. What this white is, by the way, is the white sky reflected.
So the hole in the canopy.
Of the canopy, exactly, and that's a frame. Helps to frame it in darkness, so it's naturally vignetted.
So you use a little bit of polarization just to cut it down slightly. Would that be fair to say?
I don't think it's total, but it's significant. You can still see that there's almost certainly clipping here, and a quick balance effect that I'd be tempted to do would be to take a radial, which I tend to love for zonal adjustments. And highlight recovery, probably half highlight recovery, and just probably target it a little bit more by looking at the axis of this bright area, like that. And so we're just trying to only affect anything else minimally. But it's a nice quick way of doing it. You can do it with a brush, obviously, no problem. And that's basically controlled the highlights quite well. You could take it further, or then it starts to look a bit odd.
Contrast on the edges, doesn't it?
So then we'll just sort of go in the mid-range there. And by the same token, I'm inclined to look for a radial here and go the other way, but instead of doing it with highlights, I'll probably take
the whites back up.
whites. So 0 that and bring the whites out. So we're just really trying to bring out that that bright area, and this is the equivalent of dodging. I was thinking radial.
Nicely. Yes.
Yeah, that's full whites, but I mean it's not. It's what it does is it helps. What drawing whites up is doing is increasing contrast. It's doing it in a linear fashion. It's also increasing saturation slightly. And that helps to me to balance those elements quite nicely. The lowest third of the photograph down here feels separate.
Yeah.
And that's because of the way that the water is lying around it. And part of me is thinking maybe this is a good moment to think about cropping, because it's not doing a great deal. I'm not sure that it's necessarily adding anything really strong or significant to the other forms. So let's just, out of interest, try using an unconstrained crop.
And we don't want to lose that white on the left-hand side that we've just increased.
Absolutely not. No, I mean, in fact, I'm thinking of not going too far at all. That's probably not even 5:4.
Yeah.
That'd be more like 4:3 perhaps. And even then, it for me, it's about proportions. So this zone here now starts to have more of a kind of proportionate relationship with the lower zone, with this area.
Yes.
And so I feel that feels quite natural. I might even go back and just, I'll give it a tiny bit more space, but I don't really want to run into that little nose there.
Yeah.
Or if I do, I've got to enclose it. Let's just try that. I don't know if you agonise about it. Yeah, actually, I think I could probably live with that.
Sometimes with things like this, where the bright spots, it just needs tuning down.
Exactly. Yeah, you've always got that freedom.
But it was always trying to find areas on the edge where natural boundaries lie.
Yeah. And we shouldn't spend too long working on one image, but just to look it upside down, we can see that the overall balance now, there is a flow, quite a nice flow to that.
Bit of a curve.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And even this green is working quite well. It is so green, isn't it?
Yeah.
So tell me, what do you think? I mean, in terms of the green, I'm just wondering whether we should be looking at HSL.
I think that looks fairly natural. I mean, the only thing I might do on it is just slightly darkening the greens, but you can't do that. Would that work?
Well, one thing, what I'm doing here, by the way, just while you're talking, is taking the saturation of the orange. It does appear to be orange because that's the granite. Yeah. And if we go to luminance as well, maybe lighten the oranges a little bit.
Yeah, that works nicely to bring out the colour contrast.
Notice how high the saturation is already, but if you lighten something, you lose saturation.
Yeah.
So you can then very legitimately return to saturation slider and think, it could work, because in a way then green and orange are at the almost opposite in the colour wheel. So there's a definite complementary element to that.
Quite a common cinematographic colour contrast. It's used in films quite often.
It's
like a turquoise orange and also a tealy green and orange as well.
Sure, that's true. Yes. Well, I bow to your greater knowledge there. I'm just briefly, while doing that, increasing the a little bit of shadow recovery, but actually, as much as anything, the blacks, just to stop that being too much of a black hole in there. There was a little bit of clipping, which has now disappeared. That's too much shadow recovery now, I think.
Yeah, with the blacks coming up as well.
Yeah. In fact, I'll drop that back, and that's all it needed.
Yeah. Question for you: if we go back to the right way around, would those two little dimpled rocks in the top middle bother you at all, or what's your thoughts about them?
Yes, well observed, sir. Yes, I think that they probably would. I mean, as a general rule, this is. I guess I differ from the mainstream quite a bit in this. I probably would get rid of them in this case, because it's not unbalancing anything else, as it were. But I quite like things that are a bit annoying. I've realised in my life, and visually, I quite like things that add just a frisson of complexity.
Yes.
To a composition. But I can see your point. I mean,
well, there is, and I see a few photographers doing this, which is over-composing pictures, over-simplifying pictures, and I think we've talked about this before when I've chatted with a few different photographers. And simplification is great to try and create presence of form, but there still has to be complexity. There still has to be some complexity in.
Well, in the landscape, is it not essential in a way? So just is a radical what if fix. I'm going to take a radial filter.
Yeah.
Sorry, I beg your pardon. Gradient filter, graduated. It's a bit tricky to manage because it's a rather narrow band, and I'm just. I should be able to turn it, and actually, yes, it won't show the turn symbol because it's not quite wide enough.
Yeah.
Never mind. That's good enough for now. Take the contrast right down, and then the exposure down a bit, or a contrast down and then highlight recovery, so that
blacks up a little bit.
Yeah, blacks up a little bit. That's a good idea, and then we can see that should just soften.
Yeah.
Though you see, I don't mind that presence of the songs.
Well, I wasn't sure if it needed removing. But I think it's consciously choosing to be there or not.
I would rather it was a. I suppose you could say, does it look half-hearted? I'm a great believer in things being decisive.
Yeah.
But I don't think it does particularly. So, there's many more things that I would do to this. I think we don't have time for a complex, exploration of this image, but at least that gets us on the road.
Well, the nice thing about those two marks at the top, the two rocks, is that they do fit in with the overall sweep of the picture. They're the starting or end point, depending on which way you're going to.
You could say it's a little punctuation mark.
Exactly.
Go back to grid.
Next pictures. Now, this is an interesting one. I chose 3 because you've used a polarizer, and I haven't used a polarizer that often until I started doing the filter testing recently. And I haven't used them because they've been slightly awkward to use. I know with the leaf filter system, you have to really have 2 holders, one with a polarizer on.
The old
system. The new system helps dramatically.
Yeah.
And since I've been able to use polarizers easily, I've been intrigued about their use and who uses them and why. And this is a good example of showing, I think we rightly say full on, full off, and then maybe a halfway house or a tweak.
Well, you're right. Well, what we're looking at here is on the left is unpolarized. Might have the polarizer on it, but it might be in the full unpolarized position. This one in the middle is fully polarized, and this one on the right, which is my final version, is somewhat backed off. Why? Well, if you look at the fully polarized version, which in some respects I quite like, but the definition of the pool is lost.
It's disappeared, isn't it? The boundaries.
Yeah, here, obviously in the unpolarized version, the white is totally dominant. It kind of, the picture doesn't make any sense really. Whereas what I see is this kind of tortured head emerging from the stream. And here, by reintroducing some of the reflected light in the pool, in this lovely arcing shape, it helps to just remind us that water is lying in that pool. And so although you can see water in the one in the middle, I think it's a little bit more sympathetic here. So that one would be my final choice, because I don't think there are any other major worries. Clearly, you and I have discussed blending images before. You could do that. You clearly could, especially if you wanted a really strong white line or something.
Well, because I haven't used polarizers that often, and I haven't been sure what will work the most. I've sometimes taken a picture without the polarizer, one with it but backed off, and then one with it full on. Picked and chosen. I mean, essentially, a polarizer is an artificial affectation of photography. It's nothing. It doesn't relate to things that exist in reality, but it's something that we accept as a way of working with light and photography. So I feel quite happy about combining parts of polarization.
Yes, I mean, you make a very fair point. I will say it's worth mentioning that sometimes light appears to be polarized simply because the weather and the conditions are such.
Yes.
The polarizer gives you, especially dealing with water, gives you a kind of freedom to reflect or not to reflect. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
And I suppose it's debatable, but personally I think it's a legitimate tool of the trade. Anyway.
Well, it lets you control the way water gets perceived, and essentially we sometimes perceive water because it's moving and reflections are moving. We see it in a different way to the camera sees it fundamentally. So being able to moderate that with a filter tool.
Yes. Just while we're talking, just looking at the various ways that this might be interpreted, it's quite interesting to see it upside down. You can see that there are these compositional sort of superstructures which do give it form.
Yeah.
I feel that this feels a little bit unresolved at the top stroke bottom at the moment, and this is too light on the side. It's dragging energy away. I think the focus, what needs to happen, is that the head, the kind of tortured head, needs to be properly managed. That's the sort of centre point for me. I love these sort of shapes that are kind of cradling it here. There's another kind of half a face on this side. I'm being fanciful, but there's also an Easter Island head effect. I don't know if you see that on that side. And then there's like a miniature version of it here.
Have you processed this one in Capture One, out of interest?
Good question. I think so. I'll just do a couple of quick ones here while we're just thinking about it. I think the first thing that has to be done is that this side needs to come right down. So using a radial, because it happens to coincide rather well with the overall shape that's needed. And I'll just take exposure probably. Might want to take contrast down a little bit. That might become a little bit too kind of eye-catching.
Eye-catching, very funny.
Yes, okay, sorry about that. And I'd say that this area, this is really tricky, isn't it, from a colour point of view? We've kind of, so far I've neglected to talk about the colour. But the greens, the slimy greens, because it's river, so we get slimy greens. How do you manage them? Are there ways of tweaking the hue or the saturation to make them less intrusive? And the answer is I think there probably are. I don't actually mind this colour in particular. I quite like it.
Yeah, it's not that really over intense green.
It's often these sort of greeny, sort of yellowy greens that are particularly difficult.
Normally darkening and slightly desaturating works a treat, just to moderate them slightly.
Indeed.
But they already look dark and desaturated to a certain extent.
To an extent they do. Now, I seem to remember that we've often in Capture One used the colour editor to do localised colour adjustments, and we've also lamented the fact that they weren't available in Lightroom. However, the new range mask tool may at least partially help us to resolve that. So if we take,
I've not looked at this, so I'm intrigued at what it will do.
So we're on virgin territory, as it were, here. So what I've done is just create a little radial mask here, and let's say we wanted to desaturate or hue change a specific colour in there. I'm going to go to 1:1 to target that colour. And if we turn the range mask on here, we can select colour. It's a little bit long-winded. I think that's part of the reasons I don't like it that much, but it still works. You can take the pipette and sample, I don't know, let's say I sample this dark green, and then with the shift, you notice it leaves a tiny wee
so you can add to it, can you?
Yeah, and there, and well, let's just take all the greens for sake of argument. So I'm trying to really spread the green sample, and that really was thunder, by the way.
That was thunder,
quite
it's not our tummies rumbling or anything.
And so now if we zoom back, we're still on our go back to
can we prove the selection by desaturating everything, for instance, and just seeing what gets affected or turned?
Can I just show you what's happened?
We've got a mask
over overlay.
Yes,
you see how it's selected those colours, and yes, you're absolutely right. So now let's do it very simply. We can take saturation and turn the mask off and do this.
Yeah, so you can see what it's done.
All of the exactly in that selection. It's desaturated all those colours. Now you could
We got because that hasn't made a huge effect. What happens if we change the amount slider on the mask whilst we've got that on?
Well, I had to do this. So I put
Yeah.
that's 100% saturation. So if we go 0, that leaves it in situ, and then we can go all the way right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
The effect is a lot more there.
Yeah. So I mean, the 50% figure is probably based on lots of testing. That's what I would guess.
Yeah.
They're pretty good like that. So I don't know. I'm not saying that that's exactly what I would want to do, but it does show you that this is a powerful tool with a lot of
It's
potential.
improved things.
Yeah,
Definitely.
So yeah, I've been really impressed with that. The other thing I do is probably just take this little highlight down a bit. So I'll probably just go to. Don't think we need to do anything fancy for that other than contrast and maybe a little bit of brightness down. And we could also do it with highlight recovery.
Yeah, that works.
But just to take the edge off that.
Just feather it into the body of the picture.
Gonna take the contrast right down, because it's being that really kind of granite is so strong, and when it catches the light, it's very, very eye catching. That's better. It's sort of more in keeping with the rest of it. Now our little tortured head is starting to emerge. I might well think, not going to do it now, I don't think, but might well think about these greens and do a hue change. One thing that is worth mentioning is that within that colour range, once you make that selection, you can also change hue using the temperature and tint sliders.
Yes, because that's effectively a colour filter, a hue filter over the top.
Yeah. Should we move on?
Excellent, yes.
Okay, next image is this, which is green.
That's very green.
Oy. Well, it's just as well in that case that I was thinking of doing that.
That looks lovely.
It's better, isn't it? I think.
That's it's lovely the way the tones merge in a way. You're creating a very delicate, high key tonality in those greens.
You might. I was thinking, based on what we've discussed earlier, I could easily imagine you saying, "Well, that's like infrared," but I mean, actually, it's just straight. I haven't done anything to it apart from the black and white.
Yeah, you'd expect
version.
to see in the black and white curves that the green's been increased in lightness, but it's not.
No. It's not. I suppose if you did want to make it look like infrared, you could, or if it was the wonderful old-fashioned Kodak IR film, you'd probably have to go to clarity and go like that.
Yes.
Or something like that. Now that looks like infrared.
It does.
I'm not proposing to do that, by the way. What I am proposing to do right away, though, is to just take the highlights down at this corner.
So this is another way of vignetting, isn't it? Because it's all high key. When you take the highlights down, you actually create more separation, more tonal variation in those highlights.
Well, it does, you're right, and that's something to be wary of, perhaps, because I wouldn't necessarily want to increase the contrast in there. So having said what you just said, perhaps the appropriate thing to do is actually this, to take the contrast down, and then actually what you could do, if you really wanted to go to town in avoiding detail, is take the whites down, because what that's doing is suppressing contrast. Now that's too much as it happens. So I think, to be honest, I quite liked it with contrast down is fine. And then I think we could also
I think some of the highlights down worked okay, because it did
well, I liked it.
Add a little bit of texture to
I agree. I think that's probably quite a nice combination. And it's funny how these different combinations can work well. We can just twist this around a little bit until we get the selection that we want. And bearing in mind that on Lightroom, because I still find, when we're teaching this, that the understanding of what these lines actually mean is incomplete. But just to be clear, everything in front of that line is unaffected. So this is what you might call the zero zone in terms of adjustment here. Then from here to here is 0 to 50%. So the midline is the 50% line. And then from there to this line here is the 50 to 100% line.
So it's your full transition zone, going from one far line to the other.
Yeah, the mask, the way it's almost impossible to see the effect of it. It looks very arbitrary, but it's kind of helpful for some things. And the quick fix for mask is O for overlay, so on the keyboard, which is always good, I think. I'm actually going to take the take the exposure down a little bit in that corner as well, because I think one of the, you could, but if I do that, I will want to
bring the whites back up a little bit.
Possibly, and also this. So I'm going to just extend it out, and as I realise it's fairly non-destructive, as it were. The effect, I want to sort of keep that brightness and brilliance in the top right-hand corner, because particularly these two fern leaves, I think are just, they're just beautiful. I probably ought to darken that down a little bit though. So we'll take a brush, and you just use highlights down. There we are, just knock this down a little bit.
Possibly that right-hand fern?
Thinking of this one, yes, not spotted. Yeah, because it's quite
the boundary across it then,
Yeah, no, I mean, there could even be an argument for putting in a grad from that side. So we'll see. I know that, and I'll just apply that same brush correction to here as well. So this is vignetting, you could say.
That's the sense of creating a transition edge. Can we look at your version that you have in the
Capture One?
Capture One.
See if I can find it. And we have another image that we were going to look at later, and it is here. And in this case, it has been split toned.
Yes.
I've done a bit more work on it, clearly, haven't I? I've gone darker overall.
Yeah.
Split toning, but I think only with warmth in the highlights. And overall it's gone a little bit more darkroom workerish. Yeah, if that makes sense.
Nice. I like the highlighting of those one little fern and the two ferns in the top right.
Yeah, it's worth, or at least I think it's worth looking at it at 100%, because as it's now rendered, can you see I actually focused on that leaf, and the biggest question mark for me.
Can you pause it a second? We've just had a power cut. I shouldn't make any more noise. I've just done that routine off.
Pause. Is there a pause button now?
It's okay. Just leave it. I'll be able to find it. Which is the best way of finding it? Oh, I'll be able to find it because you brought this up. That's fine. And I'll be able to skim through it. So if you go back to where you were now.
And this is battery powered.
That's battery powered, so that's fine. And you're on battery because you're on the laptop, so that's fine as well.
Okay, good.
Come on, you can shut up now. Yeah, lightning's obviously.
Yeah, taking all the power. Wow, amazing. Oh, has it come back again? So that was a temporary. Yeah, that's clever. So in Capture One,
I'm just waiting for this printer to go off.
Right. Well, yeah.
There we go. It's gone.
Okay, so in Capture One, there's it's been worked further, and I'm pretty happy with it. Split toning, so a little bit of warmth in the highlights, and a little bit more definition of the leaves, probably just by darkening down, because that helps to separate out probably steepens the curve, as it were, in the highlights. The other thing that's worth mentioning is that although it wasn't a particularly windy day, when you're by a river, there's always little riffles of convection.
Okay, yes.
That arise, so it wasn't dead still, and I'm pretty sure that this is not a short exposure. 0.8 seconds, so nearly a second. That's a long time for anything to move, anything as light and delicate as this. So it took me a long time to make the picture, because a lot of the time was just spent waiting. But you can see that it's a still moment. And I've got to say again, we often talk about the cameras we use with awe and admiration. This is a relatively old camera nowadays, but looking at a combination of camera and lens, it's very good. I mean, the fine detail is pretty remarkable, given that this is at its minimally sharpened mode in Capture One.
Yeah.
Okay, do you want to go back to Lightroom?
Yes, we go back to Lightroom. I think we've got a few more pictures before we.
And we'll just return that to there, and bring Lightroom back to life. And yes, G for grid. Now this was a tricky one. already in D for develop, and let's look at it in colour a second. Well, you can see it's pretty challenging from a colour point of view,
Yes.
partly because it's a phase 1 file, and Lightroom and phase 1 files don't usually get along that well, especially when they're made with a wide angle camera. That might be very unfair, but because I think that longer lens phase 1 images look fine in Lightroom.
Yeah.
But even with the Lightroom, with the profile apply, in fact, I think the reality is that the profile that the 35mm lens, which applies in the phase 1 back, is not seen by Lightroom.
Yeah.
So this is shot with an Alpha camera and a 35mm Ronin stock lens. There's a profile loaded into the back, which is supposed to bake it in.
Yeah.
But if the software is not read by Lightroom, and my guess is that it isn't, because look at how purple it is up here.
Yeah, so that's the edge lens cast from the edge of the picture.
Yeah, yes, and even down here, if you look at the twigs, compared with, say, the middle, which is, much more neutral. Okay, so good solution is definitely to look at this as a black and white, and I do think that it's
I prefer the structure of that image in black and white. It's the colour information isn't doing a lot to the picture, but the tonality of the rocks and the leaves and branches are wonderful.
Been a little bit of let's go back to that's an auto mix. That's interesting. I don't know if there's whether you can return it to completely neutral, but you see it's chosen quite an interesting way of going. It's actually taken yellows and greens down, and I can see why, because in here it was really, really bright, and if we take the greens up in there, that's what happens. So you can see that there might actually, to be honest, although the auto mix is quite good, I would still want to have a little play in here to see which kind of balance we're looking for. I think I particularly, one of the things I love about this, the tree in the foreground, is this sort of fantail, fishtail kind of structure to the buttress roots, and I think in a way,
green, aren't they?
Yeah, and that pulling the greens up helps to define them a little bit better against the reds and oranges of the background. We can actually take this down a little bit further. And there is a purple element in here.
Just in the top in the sky.
Yeah, just a little bit. Not sure about magenta. No, that's not doing very much. But anyway, you can see that there are different ways of thinking about it, and of course you can still do localized adjustments any way you want, and indeed that might be needed. Just briefly, rather than spending a lot of time on this image, compositionally, this is probably very unorthodox. But I actually love this branch moving in on from the right hand side, and I think it plays quite an important role. It's out of focus, as is this, and again if we look at the metadata, well, that's interesting because this is shot with a tech cam, but it shows that Adobe is reading the metadata.
Okay.
Because I put F11 into the metadata on the electronic back. Anyway,
which is about F8 on a 35mm camera.
Yeah, I think if we look at the effect,
you can see the separation.
Yeah, and I'm happy with that. I mean, these trees have still got plenty of texture, but it is falling away very nicely into the distance, and that I think actually does help the tree to come forward. Looking at this, my inclination would be, well, there's a couple of things you could do. In fact, in spite of what I've just said, I think there's an argument for possibly doing that. So that's more like 5:4, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it loses a sense of light at the top there.
It does, yeah. Agreed.
I think keeping the top might be worth lightening the.
Well, what I do, I think, is lighten this because that cap is rather intrusive, isn't it?
Yes.
So probably just do that with exposure, and then you can sort of equalize it to the trunk below.
Yeah.
Not maybe quite that much, but not that much.
That's close.
Yeah, I get there. Just so that there's a continuity there, and tune that a bit later. And you can see that the overall effect is quite nice.
Very nice.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Right, something completely different.
Yes, we've had a look at these earlier just to see when we were choosing the pictures. And you'll have to tell me why you've got two pictures, one that looks exposed perfectly and one that looks like an accident.
Yeah, well, on the face of it, they're made very, very close to one another. I actually shot 5 exposures in total, and these were the last 2. And I was shooting directly into the setting sun on a day when the air quality is quite clear, so there's not a lot of benefit from distance haze or anything like that. And while I'm very happy to an extent with the lighting on the left-hand side through here, looks good, happy with it. The sun is clearly burnt out, and with the best will in the world, I'm reasonably confident from my experience, even with using a graduated filter, which I did, that there's no way I was going to be able to get that back. So I also made an exposure, we could probably check by looking at the metadata, but I would guess it's 2 or 3 stops darker than that on the right, assuming that I would just use the bright part of this if I was going to blend them together. So that's the kind of basis of the conversation.
Yeah.
So on that basis, let us look at them in the develop module. First of all, just to see the shutter speed.
There, can't we, as well?
We can. And
1 second to a quarter of a second, 2 stops difference if they're both f11, which I think they were. Yes.
Yeah. So they're only 2 stops, so not a huge amount. But anyway, if we look at that, we can see that and there's still probably a colour on argument for tweaking the colour and all that yet. But this is the dark one, and in terms of, there's the sun. That's, if we look at the RGB values over here, which are measured in hundreds here rather than 256.
Yeah, properly clipping there, definitely.
That's definitely properly clipping.
Which it's the sun.
It's the sun, so you wouldn't worry unduly about that. But what you would worry about is the fact that that's not going to be usable, right?
Yeah, you definitely have to blend it. Well, that's what we thought.
Well, let's see. Okay, now clearly that's global. We've come up 2 1/4 stops, or so however we translate those in Adobe terms. And we still have 1 or 2 additional issues to point out, one of which is that this band down here is being affected by the colour cast of the fact that it's a drop front or rear rise
edge of the lens.
Technical camera edge of the lens issue. That can be corrected. But here's where we'd be thinking, would we not, there's going to be tons of noise. Absolutely. And it won't be usable.
Where's the noise? It's done a very, very good job.
Well, I mean, it's astonishing.
Yeah.
And I think, I always used to take those, it's got a 15 stop dynamic range arguments, which Phase will tell you, and Sony will tell you, and Canon and Nikon will tell you, with a pinch of salt. But I think that sort of illustrates the point pretty well.
And one of the things I love about this now is the sun has just a glorious glow around it. The exposure has done a very good job of not clipping too much in the highlights. It is still clipping, so we can pull back slightly on it, but it looks a natural gradient.
It does. You're absolutely right, and you can do that also with. Here's the thing. It always amazes me how, if you just use the kind of basic or normal controls, you get quite natural looking transitions. So I found I use the highlight recovery slider quite a lot in general terms in my photography, but I rarely use it around the sun. Because that's the one area where it almost always looks awful. The
gradients go very strange, they can go very strange.
They can do, yeah. Whereas actually, I'd say that what I think I would actually do here is just take this all the way back and deal with this image zonally, probably. I'm not saying there aren't any other tools that could be used, but if we just look at the sky to begin with, and also the immediate foreground, which is being somewhat influenced by the graduated filter that I used. We're up to 160, which
looks nice.
Looks pretty nice in there.
Some textures in the sun. disc, around the disc.
Yeah. And now let's try one coming up from below, bearing in mind we've still got a slight issue at the bottom which has to be dealt with. And so we're going to soften this in a minute. I think that top line should actually coincide with the horizon. Oh, and incidentally, you can do that using... Let me just start again. Because if you use Shift, you can get an absolutely...
Hold it lock a horizontal.
That's how it works, isn't it? Yeah. So yes, it locks it in the horizontal plane or vertical plane, depending which way you're going. And now we can soften it, or we can reduce contrast, or we might have to deal with that a little bit
have to
locally.
play with black density slightly, because the black density is lifted in that middle of the picture.
And actually, that actually works pretty well. The one further thing though is perhaps to look at the foreground.
Yeah, get a soft one across the
and let's absolutely, and let's not forget that the foreground also has a colour issue.
Which would be corrected by your lens cast calibrations inside.
It absolutely would.
Capture One.
So rather than just for a sort of quick and dirty effect, if we pull the tint slider this way,
and there it goes,
we can almost completely eliminate that magenta cast. And it might just need a tiny bit of blue or something as well. But without the precision of Capture One, it's still very good. Still, I would say, eminently usable for printing, and especially that what we true if we just desaturate it a little bit, which will take some of the.
But it still needs some work on the transitions on the horizon. But what I really like about that now is the sun is looking wonderful. It has a really nice transition from the disc outward. Yeah,
exactly, and clearly you can't achieve that with that overexposed version, because while you can recover a little bit of that highlight, you can't get that natural flow, because it'll never, in that great big white patch that we saw in the original, it's simply not going to come back there. I think you'll have to take our word for it on that, because I'm spending a lot of time doing that. But you can see that's lovely, isn't it? It does show that, certainly in terms of for the printer's point of view. The only thing I might do is actually just slightly lighten just in here where the cursor is.
Where
just around the edge parts of it. But that's good, isn't it? And that's in terms of mood is probably where I want to be. Okay, very briefly now, because I guess we may be running a little bit short of time. This is a black and white conversion, rather unorthodox picture, I'd say, for me, but I really enjoyed playing with it. You want to see it in colour? You see the colours are kind of rather nondescript, and
it becomes about green and blues rather than the form.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas the black and white does help you to focus on the shape of the branch. Just it's sort of dipping its way down into the lake. This is Chronic water. I beg your pardon, it's Lowe's water actually.
I do like the way the shadows or the reflections of the tonality of the branch merge and get softer as it goes below the water or goes.
It's nice, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's a sort of shimmery quality to it as well, which is a byproduct of, there you go, 3.2 seconds. So I must have used quite a strong stopping filter. Any other way, just for me, didn't quite come together. There's obviously therefore movement in the leaves.
And just as an aside, you're using the Lee Pro Glass ND filters, which are very, very good, I believe.
No, I'm very happy with them. Yeah.
Okay.
Shall we?
Next picture?
Move on. And so, still in the lakes, this is more traditional Lake District kind of theme.
I'm interested in this one because when I first saw this, I thought, it's a bit complex and busy, and I couldn't.
It's a bit of a rubbish composition, Cornish. Come on.
Yes. Yeah. What have you done?
Well,
and when we show the Capture One version, shortly we'll see what became of it.
Yeah, it's a so scale force. It's in a ravine in the northwestern lakes, and you could say it's not a particularly spectacular waterfall, but it's a very interesting waterfall because it's quite beautiful in this lower part, but also it's a very long, tall drop beyond, and it is possible if you're agile and all that stuff to climb up this rock face and into the back. However, most people will only ever see it from here, and I do find an interesting challenge in trying to depict a a subject that's a kind of landmark, and trying to make sense of it. And it's very hard to make sense of this one because of these branches spreading out over it. So rather than artificially try to adopt an angle that just isolated one small part of the waterfall, which one can obviously do, I've just gone with it. So I'm looking at the lower fall and the upper fall, and I've tried to, you see this little arch around the top of the upper fall, and how this one is very deliberately
got against the darks, and
to go against the darks and to be positioned around the top of that waterfall. So, maybe nobody else is going to notice, I don't know, but to me those kind of attention to detail is quite important. Now, the quickest way to do this would be just to go straight to the Capture One version if you want to see that, or we can look at how to do it in Lightroom.
Yeah, well, what we thought, the thinking was, and you pointed out, the complexity, or the thing that distracts, is the bottom part of the picture.
Yes.
And it'd be interesting to see how that's resolved. So yes, I'd be interested to see how you would approach it.
Very quickly then, we're going to take you could use a grad filter, but if you look at the shape here of the bits that need to be darkened down, I think it's clear that a radial filter should get us pretty close. So why don't we just use exposure? Nice thing about exposure is it does give quite a believable organic transition, to worry too much about stuff. Whereas with many of the other adjustments, they do bring about changes that are quite obvious. You could also potentially take contrast down a bit, although you have to be wary of taking it down too much, because then it will start to look quite unnatural. Take it a bit too far and then come back. And then one of the beauties of Lightroom is the fact that you can take the brush from the radial filter, the internal brush, and we'll take the flow down a little bit and just move some of that darkness, borrow it as it were, into this column in the middle. I think the other thing I was very keen to do is to keep this little side fall as part of the kind of language of the image. So what I'm going to do now is, this is quite bright, but I'll leave that for now. Those little white lichens. We'll take a new one, a radial filter. I'm going to do a super thin and move it right over. That is doing the opposite of what I wanted to do at the moment.
Yeah.
Now, most of what makes that interesting to me is the fact that, the water is blue.
Yeah.
So this is another opportunity to use the range mask tool. So if we go to color and select that, and we'll pop one in here as well, just in case there's any variation. And if we look at O, we can see that's what it's done, and we could use whites.
Yeah.
To brighten it up.
Bringing them out, yes.
And that's quite a nice job, and maybe just make sure it's not clipping. It is just clipping, so I'll pull that back a bit. And then we use a little bit of exposure as well. Whoops, and there's different ways it can be interpreted, and we could actually just reduce the contrast a little bit so it doesn't get too peaky.
Yeah.
And now come out of that, and now it might be a bit much, but you see the general idea. It's now much more in keeping with the other white highlights. So we look at the white highlights down here, which incidentally, surprisingly, aren't really any brighter than they are here. I think there's an argument probably that the greens could all do with being subdued a little bit, and indeed, why don't we look at that? We take a graduated filter and maybe take the range mask again, color, and select greens with a few variations, so we
make sure you get the range. This is where you'd like a little pie select chart like in Capture One.
Absolutely. There we are. And that's probably
that's done
the trick. So it doesn't darken all of the dark shadows any further. You might actually want to take some of these highlights down as well. So that could be another filter. But anyway.
So should we look at your Capture One version of the final one?
Yeah, absolutely.
But you can see it here that it's balanced so much better already.
I think so.
The attention's gone upwards into the picture.
That's right. So it's sort of moved air back into, in towards the waterfall. Noticeable that this rock here, bottom left, still needs a little bit of extra, management just to take it down. But this one's definitely come back in. It looks, I think, reasonably natural in there.
Yeah.
I'd probably take the highlights down in that.
Which we could use the colour range again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so overall, but let's see, we'll come out of that full frame and have a very quick look at Capture One as well. Just see if there's a version of this, which hopefully there will be, and see how different it is. Probably quite similar, I would think.
Yeah. And you can see you've done the work on the little rock in the bottom left.
Yes.
And on the tree, on the yellow trunk on the top left.
I think I probably needed a little bit more work at it now. Looking at that was one of the. That was a success, I think, from Lightroom. But yeah, it's had a little bit more different work. It's had a lot more time on it. So. But
the whole of the picture comes together now, where it didn't when at first glance.
Yes, well, that's pleasing. I mean, I do think that that for me, my photography is at least in part, the pleasure of recording, of going to a place and producing something that still remains entirely recognisable, but is and so the edits therefore need to be a balance between moderation and modulation of editing something that is visually pleasing and at the same time back on the Lightroom we want, is believable and indeed it's easy to relate to what it's of. And I actually think that there is a documentary value in all of that.
I think we just got a couple more pictures. One I think we can show briefly. It's an experiment in light.
Yes, I think in this case we're going to very quickly go to the Capture One version, but this just shows two images from a single session and how the idea might evolve. I mean, for me, the clouds on the horizon are the key, are the clue, because it's that wonderful dappled lighting that you associate with the Lake District that I didn't really get. Now we had a little bit as time went by. We got some softened light. The clouds did come forward a little bit. Again, you look at the clouds in the distance, but they weren't perhaps providing quite the definition that I would like to have seen. And so in the end, if we look at Capture One, I put in a false shadow. How obvious that is remains to be seen, but let's have a look at it here. Now that's not done with any retouching, it's just done by using light.
So we've just created a cloud shadow.
Just a cloud shadow in the middle distance, yeah.
Which relates to that dappled light in the background.
Yeah. Should I feel guilty?
I don't think you should feel guilty at all. I think the end result is a moment that you saw. You can see the dappled light in the background over the hills.
So the transitions here where the cursor is, that can be done very easily with a brush. The rest of the image is virtually untouched. So the feeling of sunlight, where you have sunlight, you can create something softened simply by darkening and reducing saturation and by cooling.
Yes.
That combination, which is exactly what happens in a shadow.
Yeah, the cooling is an important part.
Very
definitely.
Important. Yeah.
And in many ways, this is like the light would acting as another vignette, coming back to that idea of the way you use the shaded areas of a picture to vignette the subject.
It's what painters have always done.
Yes.
It's easy to forget that. It's what painters have always done. And I do think that, that there will always be some people who, for good reason perhaps, will say, well, photography is, has to be true to life, and others who believe you can do anything, and I'm probably somewhat agnostic about it. I think it depends on the intention.
Well, when I did some work for the Wildlife Photography competition, where we tried to set rules, which is one of the only places where rules make any sense in photography, as part of a competition like that, where they're subjective. But hard and fast rules about editing were very difficult to make. So in the end, all sorts of pixel editing like cloning were barred, but any edits that didn't affect the intrinsic truth of the picture, we came up with this general idea of do not deceive the viewer. If the viewer feels deceived because what was actually there and what the photograph was of beyond a photographic change, then it's wrong. And so I like that general rule.
That feels good to me. So do I get away with it or not?
Yes.
Okay.
In my eyes. And it's all subjective.
Exactly. There's another comparison, which you were...
I was intrigued about polarization again, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, so the example on the left is fully polarized. The example on the right still has a polarizer on, but it's in the unpolarized position. The polarizer on means that the exposure time remains relatively lengthy, and there may actually also be a four-stop filter in there. I'm not too sure. Four-stop ND, just to get the exposure down to a manageable level where you get a sense of flow and so on.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was fun to do. I'm not saying either it is a fantastically satisfactory
Which
image.
one did you choose as the interesting?
This one.
Yeah.
So yeah, like the blue. I think that the blue and the orange and actually the film of water helps to simplify and define the space better. So yeah, while I probably won't ever do anything with that picture, I think that as it's just note taking. You learn from all these experiences and ideas, and you can now. I probably would be able to a little bit more quickly reach the conclusions I needed to if I was in a slightly more promising situation, where in let's say a similar. On a similar occasion where the light was, say, better. I mean, this is very, very harsh overhead sunlight with only the dappled light giving any kind of redemption at all. So I think we've got one more to do, but I don't think that we're seeing it in Lightroom. So
okay.
Shall we
Yes.
return to Capture One and talk about it briefly? So it's this.
Yes.
Which, as you can tell, is a portrait of David Ward.
He's there somewhere.
He's in it somewhere. Oh dear.
And where is this?
It's Waswater.
Yeah, there is.
Yeah.
Yes.
So it is, I believe, either the most popular or the second most popular view in Britain, according to some survey that was done by one of the major national newspapers 2 or 3 years ago. Or it might have been the BBC, I don't know. But anyway, it was a big national competition, and the view of Waswater with Great Gable in the distance is a classic, and I'm pretty sure that almost everyone watching this video will have been to this spot.
Well, that is a fantastic picture, and even better for that little lenticular. Well, I'm not sure it's a lenticular cloud, but it's a lenticular shaped cloud in the background.
Yeah, wasn't that lucky?
Echoed by the rock platform and the little cap on the mountain as well in the middle.
Yeah. Well, that's one of those things, and we had a wonderful session there with the group, and once everybody had set up and decided what they wanted to do and were happy, we were able to get on with it. And so I was able to shoot this once I got the composition resolved, which took me several minutes.
Yeah.
I then shot 2 or 3, and then did a further refinement, and then I just stayed with it and probably had that position for an hour.
Right, just watching the conditions change.
Probably made 15 exposures over that time. Every single one is completely different. And this is the only one that has this exact formation. So it had to be the one with David in it.
Yeah.
It had to be.
We can't clone out David, is that against the rules?
That would definitely be against the rules, especially according to wildlife photography.
Yes, he'd notice it, wouldn't he?
You definitely need to keep the wildlife intact, right?
Well, thank you very much for that, Joe. It's most enjoyable and entertaining and informative as ever.
Thanks, Tim. I enjoyed it too.